You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
Hello, this is episode 239. On today's show, I'm going to talk about North Korea. It seems that we're moving in the wrong direction diplomatically there. I want to talk about the Syrian Civil War and some of the Middle East politics going on right now between Syria, Turkey, and Iran. And I wanted to get into a Bandow article on Venezuela. For those of you who would like to share today's show, foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, or just go to the libertarianinstitute.org, and there you'll find my podcast, Foreign Policy Focus, on the homepage, as well as my daily news roundup. So, again, most of the work I do there at the libertarianinstitute.org. Before I get into the North Korea stuff, I just got one story that's primarily coming out of the U.S., and that is the judge in the Guantanamo Bay case, the trial there where the United States has been pretty slowly, if at all, looking to prosecute the alleged perpetrators, or I guess planners of the 9/11 terror attack in New York. The most famous of those is Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who I believe is pretty much known to be the main planner of the 9/11 attacks. That's certainly his claim, and there's a lot of complicated motions going on with this trial. Most of these deal with the fact that a lot of these, I think all of these detainees, I believe there's about 5 that are on trial, were tortured. And so some of the evidence that will likely be used against them will have come through the torture, and whether that's allowed in court has been a big question. And then also just, I'm sure on the defense, they're going to use the fact that these guys was tortured as ways either to look to get them some kind of leniency or get them off, avoid the death penalty. So, there's a lot of complicated motions and stuff like that going on. I also think it's more of a military trial. This was I believe a colonel who resigned. Now, the statement coming out, from the U.S. is that this isn't going to slow down the pace of the trial at all. The reason I wanted to note this and bring this story up is one, just a reminder that these guys are still on trial, and, from what I understand, all these guys are guilty as hell of being involved in planning 9/11 and should, therefore at the very least spend the rest of their life in prison. However, justice can be done here, and I think it's a injustice not only, to the people that, still haven't had their trial, but mostly to the American people who haven't been able to, have this process of justice. What we all agree is how we get justice through a court system. And that's the way that our society has decided that, when something unfair is done, this is the way that, we have response to it. And, if warranted, people get reparations, or at least people get punishment. And, that has not happened here with this trial. And, largely it seems because of the way the United States government is dragging its feet, due to the, programs surrounding, the abduction, of some of these guys. I'm not sure how all of them were captured, but of course the, extraordinary rendition program that was going on after 9/11 has a lot of, potential war crimes against, U.S. politicians, officials, and, CIA members dating back that time, and then the torture program. And so this is, I think in a way also deprived the American people of justice. And so, if you see, hear news coming out about the Gitmo trial coming up here, it may be because, the new judge has different positions on some of these issues. I do understand though that, the likely judge that was either already appointed to replace the retiring judge or will be is a recommendation of that prior judge. All right, North Korea stuff. So I talked about in the last show very briefly that Donald Trump said he was canceling Mike Pompeo's trip to North Korea. One of the things about the Trump administration does seem to be that very difficult to predict what Donald Trump is doing. In one, sense, he seems that he's saying that I'm going to let this process take as long as it needs to take. And then next he's canceling Pompeo's trip to North Korea, which if you understand this is a long progress, I think you understand that there's going to have to be a lot of means between the United States and North Korea to really work this process out. Now it's coming out that the United States is saying that was because of a quote-unquote belligerent letter that the United States has decided to withdraw from those talks or cancel Mike Pompeo's trip to North Korea. Now, nobody has seen the letter, to my knowledge. At least nobody has reported on the letter that has seen it, to my knowledge. So I don't know what the word belligerent means. So this means that North Korea is saying that we are absolutely not going to give up nuclear weapons until we see some sanctions relief or, some security guarantees from the United States that these things have to come first, that there has to be a normalization of relations first. Or does that mean, that Kim Jong-un sent Donald Trump a picture of him giving Trump the middle finger and saying, I'm gonna nuke you, buddy. Obviously each one of those, I try to put the extreme there, of what it could possibly be, because we really don't know. And until we do, I can't give a whole lot of my thoughts on, Donald Trump's move here. It's definitely unfortunate. It's definitely a bump in the road if we are, one day, 10 years looking back, we have a peaceful Korean peninsula, a more liberalized North Korean society, and no nuclear weapons on the Korean peninsula. This could just be a bump in the road. However, this could be, the bump in the road that breaks the axle and, really takes the wheels off these peace talks. Now, South Korea seems unfazed more or less by whatever's going on between the United States and North Korea, and is just as willing and dedicated towards the peace process as they were before. South Korean officials have come out and said that Trump canceling these talks is hurting Korean unity, and so I've even seen some reporting that South Korea is potentially looking at more independent tracks that they could take to resolve some of the issues that they have on the Korean peninsula. So I guess, referring back to what I've said this whole time, the most important thing that Trump is doing is just staying out of it. It would be great if we had a president that was really encouraging and helping this process along. But at the very least, as long as he's not threatening fire and fury, not trying to place sanctions on South Korea to prevent any kind of détente between the two countries, is a good thing. Now, there is this issue here where we have South Korea looking to build a liaison office inside of North Korea, and the United States considering saying that this is a violation of U.S. sanctions because that South Korean business will have power, and so that would violate the U.S. energy sanctions against North Korea. And so if the United States starts taking those kind of steps, then we are really hindering the peace process. Another thing the United States could really do to mess up the peace process is by resuming war games on the Korean Peninsula and with South Korea. And I believe one of the things I've seen North Korea complain about in the past few days is saying that the United States is carrying out the same kind of war games they would carry out in South Korea with Japan just, a few hundred miles away. But we do have James Mattis saying that, if things with North Korea don't work out, the United States is going to go back to having, I think he calls them military drills, but they're really war games. Is, a trial run, of a plot to decapitate the North Korean regime, take out their nuclear weapons positions, or where we think they are, stuff like that. So again, these are the kinds of things that I could move us in the wrong direction. I'm not quite sure what the plan is here by Trump. I don't want to be too optimistic and make it sound like, I'm just trying to find any way for, Donald Trump to be doing the right thing here, because I certainly don't have a whole lot of faith in the president. However, you really want to see good things happen on the Korean Peninsula, and anything we do that keeps us away from the fire and fury territory is really what needs to happen. Even if, the United States just enters into a long-term freeze agreement with North Korea, where we're not putting on additional sanctions, we're not carrying out war games with South Korea, and North Korea isn't conducting nuclear weapons testing or missile testing, and maybe they're not constructing any new nuclear sites, then that's something that, we should even be able to live with. Certainly the South Koreans seem that they would be willing to. So even that situation would be a lot better, and pretty much hope for anything but nuclear war there. All right. So on the Turkey situation, there's a pretty good article in The Atlantic by Joost Hilterman. I think in the past I mispronounced his name as Joost, because Joost Hilterman. I will link to the article in the show notes page. And his article is titled Turkey Bets Against Assad and Loses. And he kind of goes over the history between Erdogan and, as he rose to power in Turkey, and then his relationship with Assad in Syria. And in fact, up until 2011, where you have like the Arab Spring and all that stuff going on, Turkey is actually moving closer to Syria, seeing that if you look at, a map of the Middle East, you'll see that the position that Syria is in relative to Turkey really opens up a lot of trade routes to the rest of the Middle East for Turkey, especially since the western portion of that country and then northern Iraq has a heavy Kurdish presence. Of course, the Kurds, particularly the Syrian Kurds and the Turkish Kurds, the YPG and the PKK militias are enemies of the Turkish government. So, this is an opportunity for Turkey to gain trade with the rest of the Middle East and Arab world. However, the Syrian Civil War really cuts that off, and Turkey's position of backing the rebels, thinking that this would net them maybe a more friendly government in Damascus, and rather than having a situation where maybe, they're paying some taxes or tariffs, transporting stuff through Syria, they're able to get like kind of a sweetheart deal, better access to Syrian oil or something like that. Well, as we know how the Syrian war plays out, this really blows up in Turkey's face, because it now appears that Assad will win the Syrian Civil War. There's only really a few pockets of rebels left. There's the U.S. protected rebels in South Syria. There's a few enclaves that are controlled by ISIS in pretty rural and isolated areas. And then there's the U.S.-backed forces to the east of the Euphrates River and this pocket of rebels. And I've seen reports up to like 70,000 fighters, 100,000 fighters, or as low as about 30,000 fighters, 70% controlled by Al-Qaeda. And that is between the Syrian and Turkish border is where these rebels are hanging out now. Now, previous agreements between, I believe, Syria, Turkey, Russia, and Iran, where Turkey was supposed to go in and clear out these areas of Al-Qaeda fighters. But as I mentioned on last week's, last show, on Monday's show, in the Moon of Alabama blog there, he points out a stat that about 70% of that territory is controlled by either Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, or Harir al-Tasham HTS. Any of these, groups are just the, kind of jihadist types that were supposed to be cleared out. They obviously weren't. And now Syria is going to go to war there. But this basically means that Turkey bet really wrong, especially because, Turkey betting on the rebels. Originally the United States was backing on the Free Syrian Army rebels. However, turns out that those guys are really Al-Qaeda and ISIS most of the time, just like they are in Idlib. And so the United States shifts policy and starts backing the Syrian Kurds in order to help fight against ISIS. Now, the Syrian Kurds are very linked to the Turkish Kurds, and depending on what source you read, the YPG, the Syrian Kurdish militia, and the PKK, the Turkish Kurdish militia, are either the same group with the same leadership or are, pretty distinct and separate groups. It seems that, as always, the truth is more in the middle than it is on one side or the other. But there has been some evidence that I've seen in some sources that I've read that I believe are typically right, that say that the PKK and the YPG are pretty close. You'll also see, at least previously in a lot of Syrian Kurdish controlled territory, pictures of the PKK leader Öcalan, who I believe is still imprisoned in Turkey right now, but he's kind of almost a mystical type leader of the Turkish Kurds and the PKK militias, where there's like some prayers and rituals to the guy that seem to go a little bit even beyond like the United States, place your hand over your heart, do the Pledge of Allegiance, kind of because the Pledge of Allegiance isn't to Trump, it's to the country. But if it was to Trump, that it seems like that's the kind of thing that they do. Anyways, the United States providing all these arms and weapons and training to the Syrian Kurds, Turkey believes has helped the Turkish Kurds, and Turkey's stance on is that the YPG and the PKK are the same thing. The PKK, the Turkish Kurdish group, is actually labeled a terrorist group by the Turkish government and by the Western governments. The YPG is as well by Turkey, but not the U.S., obviously, as we've been backing them in Syria for a long time. So Turkey loses on several fronts here. The fact that Assad isn't overthrown, makes it so that I'm sure Assad is going to be less friendly towards Turkey in the future, and will, find that they have a less cooperative neighbor. There's going to be a big problem coming in the Idlib province here, as I'm assuming the Syrian government is going to open up the next front there early in September and start to look to get rid of the rebels controlling that area of northern Syria. There's, I believe, about 2 million people, right? 2 to 2.5 million people in that area. And so you're looking at a lot of potential refugees that will likely flee over the border into Turkey, including a lot of Al-Qaeda fighters that will bleed over the border into Turkey as well. And I'm sure, no country wants a bunch of jihadists running around there. So, more ways that Turkey loses. Overall, I think if you're, an honest, maybe Turkish nationalist looking back over time at, kind of what unfolded in Syria and, what the Turkish government did, I think ultimately, looking back, you can only conclude that Turkey took steps backwards with the actions that they took in Syria. Now, Erdogan is going to travel to Iran on September 7th, and it does look like you have some interesting things developing. And I talked about this on last week's episode, just how the U.S. sanctions had taken place against Iran in particular, but also Russia, and have pushed other countries to seek alternative relationships. And it looks like Turkey is maybe looking maybe to move closer to Iran, but certainly to continue trade with Iran, even though the U.S. sanctions will be in place. We could also be looking here at deals to help ease the Syrian Civil War. Iran is, maybe other than Russia, Assad's strongest ally, and just signed another military deal with Syria. And I believe Iranian forces will at least be involved in like advise and assist type roles in the, campaign in the Idlib province of Syria. But that could be kind of like the United States as advise and assist, and it's a much more militant role. Either way, it still seems that Assad in Syria assess that Iran is playing a pretty vital role in the Syrian Civil War and helping to, from the Assad position, liberate Syria from the rebels. Staying in the same general arena, we have Iran filing a motion, or a lawsuit actually, with the International Court for Justice against the United States, saying that the sanctions that the United States is placing back on Iran are in violation of a 1955 treaty with Iran. And the United States has also cited this treaty in the past. So it may be something hard for the United States to try to, say this never happened. I don't have a lot of faith that the International Court for Justice has really enough teeth to force the United States to lift these sanctions. But it could be a ruling situation that gives other countries maybe some more leverage to continue to trade with Iran, saying that we have a commitment to follow the rulings of the International Court of Justice, and therefore we're going to ignore the U.S. sanctions and continue to trade with Iran. Maybe Turkey would be in this position, or some other countries. On the last show, I talked about some Afghan talks that were going to be held in Moscow, and I believe only the Taliban were planning on attending. The United States and the Afghan government rejected invitations. Russia has announced that they're going to postpone those talks that were supposed to happen in September at the protest of the Afghan government. Very disappointing at the Taliban, which seemed, at least up until recently, to have been a pretty isolated group on the international stage. Nobody's really going out and talking to them, looking for an end to that conflict. If Russia is stepping up and do that, all the better to get, kind of publicly out what the Taliban want. And even if it's not something that could be met, just knowing, I think, could help people to realize that maybe there are some places where we could start to move forward on the Afghan war. All right, wrap up talking about this Bandow article on Venezuela, and I will link to that in the show notes page. But basically what Bandow says is that on 2 occasions at least, Trump has pushed to have some people agree that it would be a good idea to intervene militarily in Venezuela. Certainly the humanitarian situation there isn't great. There's rampant currency inflation, which has now led to price inflation in that country. There's a shortage of goods. I was reading last week that I guess there's a lot of migrants crossing over into Brazil now, and this seems to be creating some local tensions where maybe some migrants stole something and then some locals beat a group of migrants in retaliation or retribution. Depending on what you read, and Mads Blumenthal and Rania Kalik are two people who I have some respect for their reporting, and they typically do a pretty good job of speaking the truth. And I don't think they're necessarily dishonest people. Have gone out and reported that a lot of the violence in Venezuela is not just the government acting on resistance to the government, but people who are armed and resistant to the government attacking people who are supportive of the government. However, this is a situation where you do have to look, and the Maduro government is making Venezuela poorer. It's hurting the civilians. It is carrying out violence against its own civilians. Depending on how much of that is reactionary, I'm not sure. You also have to look, there's a lot of U.S. meddling in Venezuela as well. However, Venezuela isn't a place that myself, and I'm sure almost all of my listeners, really wouldn't want to live. Have a much better standard of living in whatever country that you're all in. And so for that reason, U.S. policy in the past 25 years or so says that we have a right to overthrow the leadership of your country and try to install a more just and fair system of government there. We want a democracy where everybody gets the right to choose whoever they want, kind of with the asterisk, so long as that person's okay with the United States. And all the coverage we need is that you have a brutal and terrible government. Look at Libya, Iraq under Saddam, Syria, North Korea, Iran, even Russia. The United States takes very hostile positions against these countries because they disagree with the form of government and the leadership there, and the humanitarian situation that the civilians live in. And in all of these places, well, maybe minus Russia, there's been an attempt either against the government or, heavy pressure from the United States for the people to rise up and overthrow the government. Those in favor of regime change, in almost all cases, and in this Venezuela case, will say, one, it's about kind of world economy, that Venezuela's oil is being squandered. And so that if we could go in, we're going to increase the economic welfare of the people and just generally improve the humanitarian conditions in the country. They argue that it'll be cheaper for the United States to carry out the military intervention, maybe rather than seeing a situation like you have in Syria with a whole bunch of refugees being everywhere. And they'll argue that it's going to save lives. That if we go in, maybe some people will die from our bombs, but at the end of the day, we're going to kill less people than the dictator of the country would. Bandow really goes through and I think does a good job of breaking down these issues. Iraq is a good example of how it economically wasn't beneficial really for anyone, even the Iraqi people themselves. The United States didn't get the oil. It didn't bring down the, price of oil on the world market. It didn't crank out a bunch more oil for the Iraqi people, so they all got rich. Cost the United States. These wars are so expensive, and everybody estimated that the Iraq war will be over quickly. I mean, I was looking at some old statements from John McCain saying that we're going to roll right in, and this is going to be really cheap and really easy. And $3 trillion or so later, we're still throwing money at Iraq trying to fix that problem. I think the cost of lives argument is pretty weak. Obviously, you can't, refute a hypothetical counterfactual. So I can't say for sure that had Saddam stayed in power until 2018, from 2003 to 2018, there wouldn't be a massive civil war that kills about 1 million people, and that generally less people than that are going to die and live a higher quality of life. But if you look at the situation, it does seem that, that would mostly be the case, especially minus U.S. sanctions against Iran in the 1990s. And then Bandow, I think the strongest argument is just, the whole, what is the United States? And we're not the world police. As James Madison, kind of famously said, we don't search the world for monsters to destroy. And even if we did, and even if that was the policy, there's a lot bigger monsters out there than Maduro. And there's a lot of these regimes that rather than, looking to overthrow them, maybe we could just stop supporting them. Primarily Saudi Arabia, where I actually did see, and I want to note that James Mattis said that if Saudi Arabia didn't try to reduce civilian casualties in Yemen, then they could lose some U.S. support. But this is a country that twice in August has killed 20 plus children. I think the first time it was 40 and the second time it was 22. Very innocent children bombing civilian targets. The first one was a school bus. The second one was a displaced person camp. And I think actually they hit that camp with 2 airstrikes. The second one, the children actually fled for coverage on a bus when that bus was blown up as well. And so you look at regimes like this where the United States, even though we've had 3.5 years of Saudi war crimes committed against Yemen, we continue to help that country and sell them bombs. And they're using American-made bombs to blow up these Yemeni children. But at the same time, we have this moral desire, and one of the things that we have to do is go kill Maduro. And so that's obviously inconsistent, and it's really, as Bandow points out, it's just all about, the weapons makers and the war state and the Pentagon bureaucracy looking for another front to open up, figuring that Venezuela could be easy enough. I'm sure most of them are dumb, and they think, well, at least they're not Muslims, so we won't have to deal with, terrorists or anything like that. All right, that's where I'll wrap up today's show. We'll link to the Turkey article and the Bandow article, the Hilterman article and the Bandow article in the show notes page for those of you who want to read it. Neither of those articles are super long, especially not as long form as that doctoral article I talked about on Monday's show. So I really recommend going and checking those out. They give you a lot of good, solid information in a short, condensed space that will help you really to understand, the Syrian Civil War, Turkey, and then also Venezuela, which, as, Trump apparently has a desire to look, towards military action in that country. It's very important that we're able to explain to people why that would be a bad deal. All right. If you want to share the show, libertarianinstitute.org, you find my show and my daily news roundup on that website. I suggest everybody go there. The show notes page is there, or at foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com. The Libertarian Union on Facebook at KYAAALE on Twitter. And then for those of you who really like the show and can take a couple bucks a month to support the show, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. I do post some bonus content up there. I have a thing to post that I did with Pat McFarlane and Will Porter on censorship and all that stuff. So, definitely think about, donating to the show and helping it to grow more. So thanks, everyone.